Hello and welcome to the Flourishing Introvert Talks with me, 𝗞𝗲𝘆 𝗣𝐻𝑆. This is the podcast that celebrates the natural gifts of introverts so that we can flourish in all situations.
Episode 321, When Standards Remain Unspoken. We all know how important clear communication is, but as introverts, are there things that we tend to hold back on? I'll use me as an example on the basis that you may well recognise some of your own behaviour and tendencies. I have been called a perfectionist for as long as I can remember, although I never saw it myself. My standard response when someone levelled it at me was, "You're joking, aren't you? There's so much I could be doing better." That tended to elicit a wry chuckle from them before they muttered, "Exactly." I never quite understood that comment, but accepted the essence of the feedback as I set high standards that some struggle with. I guess we never really see ourselves as others see us until we ask them to show us. Having taken on board that my standards might be unrealistic in some situations, I felt duty-bound, part of being a lifelong learner, to explore where they had come from and why they still existed. This is tough for me to share here, but I'm not sure the picture is complete without it, so here goes. The sense I was finally able to make of it through coaching and supervision was that I'd really only experienced conditional love. My parents were both teachers who prided themselves on their academic and practical or social achievements, so as you might imagine, I was encouraged to do well and chided quite harshly when I didn't. When I did meet their expectations, I was rewarded with love and affection. That's when I heard them talk about me with pride in their voices. I don't remember that kind of warmth, that unconditional love for just being who I was, their daughter. I remember going through phases of imagining I'd been adopted, as I knew there was something missing. This was a significant realisation for me and fundamental to me being able to understand what made me tick regarding my own standards. I don't think they have ever really been a conscious choice. After all, I'd never actively defined the standards I upheld. They're just part of who I am. The next aha moment was rather more disturbing, though. The standards I upheld for so long had been more about pleasing others and attracting their love and recognition than meeting my own needs. That was a painful realisation. And finally, because I decided I must have been a disappointment to my parents for continually not meeting their expectations, I guess I decided that maybe it was best to keep mine to myself. And so the pattern began. Not the best decision I've ever made. Maybe now I can clearly define the underlying purpose of this episode, which is in part about getting you to recognise your own patterns. These days, I consider myself a recovering perfectionist, and I'm working hard at it, partly because I have over 6 decades of entrenched behaviours, beliefs and habits to reimagine. And if I can do it, so can you, and that's what I'm here to support. I think a little like many other habits we work at changing, it's one day at a time, and I've really learned how to distinguish when good enough is good enough. And when it isn't good enough, it's not a slight on who I am or who others are. This was tough for me at first because I feared lowering my standards might negatively impact my credibility. But ironically, the opposite was true. People around me knew only too well when I was pushing for either the impossible or the unnecessary, so being freed from that cage was a huge relief to us all. Seeing anything familiar yet? If I take this into the introverts' world of work, I have noticed that most of those I work with operate with an unspoken belief that keeping their head down, doing great work to their own predefined high standards, will ultimately meet the mark and be recognised. If only it were that simple. Because I've also been in and around organisations for long enough now to know that most employers, A, expect their people to be turning out great work regardless of the conditions, B, don't effectively model how to communicate their expectations, and C, are too busy to notice those who are not a problem. It's a classic case of the squeaky wheel getting the grease and we're not squeaky. And personally, I have no desire to be squeaky. So here we get to the nub of this episode. We have these standards for a variety of reasons, ranging from those that keep us safe from a whole variety of things to those that are unconsciously inbuilt. And your reason is, of course, personal to you. In my case, my standards enabled me to be proud of my work, which ultimately reinforced my self-worth whilst impressing those who mattered to me. I've always had a strong work ethic and was brought up to believe that a job worth doing was worth doing well. In fact, I can hear my dear departed dad's voice saying exactly that to me now. But I didn't readily articulate my standards because of being called a perfectionist, not wanting to disappoint, and because I genuinely didn't expect others to hold the same standards as me. I strongly suggest, though, that every now and again it's worthwhile unpacking our standards together with our reasons for holding them to see if they are still valid or relevant. And I think we need to be ready to be able to explain them rather than justify them defensively to others. Because when we don't articulate our standards, we often tell ourselves we're simply being low maintenance or easy to work with. But if I'm honest, there were times I was avoiding being questioned, challenged, or even misunderstood. Keeping them to myself gave me a sense of control. Once they're spoken, they're open to interpretation, negotiation, and sometimes disagreement. And that can feel uncomfortable. More reasons to disappoint. And thinking about it now, why do we become defensive or protective of our standards? Why do we feel the need to justify them? In my case, it was a pattern I fell into because I was criticised so much and just wanted unconditional love. I can now see, though, that it's really not helpful. If it's true that we as introverts only communicate what we believe is necessary, how can we reframe just how important and necessary it is to communicate our standards and expectations? And just to be clear, we don't need to do it for others' approval. This isn't about seeking validation. We need to do it so that we can manage expectations and collaborate effectively. How are we ever going to work well with others if there is too much that remains unsaid? None of us are mind readers, nor should we be expected to be. Do you know just how much miscommunication costs business and individuals? It's huge. The good news from our perspective as introverts is that we're unlikely to swamp people with information. That's not our natural MO. But we do need to provide people with what they need in order to do their own great work. I've come to believe that it's actually mean-spirited not to provide that. It's akin to setting people up to fail. Because if I don't share what my expectations are and what good looks like to me, I'm not being fair on others. I'm effectively holding people to a standard they haven't been given the opportunity to understand. And when I look at it that way, staying silent is no longer neutral. It's a choice that creates confusion, mistrust, or worse. Besides which, as managers, leaders, and employers, we have a duty of care, which includes letting people know what is expected of them, letting them know how they are doing, the extent to which they are meeting the required standards, and providing them with relevant opportunities to improve. So there's absolutely no point in holding unrealistic standards if you're going to expect others to know what they are as if by osmosis. Because if those standards remain unspoken, they don't really function as standards for anyone else. They become private expectations that others are unknowingly measured against. And it's never, I repeat, never right to justify your silence with, well, they should just know that. Now, if like me, being more realistic about your standards and expectations, together with how you communicate them, is the way to go, what really enhances your credibility is being prepared to be more visible as you communicate them. And let's be clear about the role of necessary visibility, because it's not just for the sake of being seen. It doesn't require making a song and dance of it in the spotlight. Heck no. But it does require you to have the conviction and presence to stand behind your expectations as you explain them. Note, explain, not justify. And no, dropping them in an email won't suffice. That's what you do after you've had the conversations with people, so you know your point has landed and they had a chance to respond and ask their questions. It also gives you the opportunity to shift or modify your expectations. They are not set in tablets of stone. Visibility when communicating standards is not about looking for people to validate you or your expectations. It's a simple courtesy and good practice. It's about honest communication without hiding. And in my case, I was no longer looking to please people or win their admiration. For me, it's about doing the decent thing and having unconditional positive regard for my fellow humans. And that is the basis of unconditional love. It's also the basis of true collaboration, which is really about win-win negotiations and finding what works best for us all so we achieve the desired outcome. It's not about dictating, being entrenched, or assuming your way is the only way. So the lesson in this episode has been about how our standards can be empowering and the foundations of great collaborations, or a cage with no apparent way in or out. Having said that, I guess there's one final point I really want to make. Don't compromise your standards just to appease others, or to make their life easy, or to win their admiration like I did. You're worth more than that, and that's not what your standards are for. By all means, examine them closely, listen to others' perspectives, explore options and compromise where appropriate so that it improves an outcome. Let me finish with probably the biggest lesson for introverts to take on board. If you're either somehow ashamed of your standards or feeling guilty for having them in the first place, holding back from sharing them is not the answer. Your expectations and opinions count, so they and you deserve to be heard. Please don't self-silence, especially begrudgingly. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, then please subscribe, rate us and leave a comment, because we know that helps other people find the podcast. And if other people find us, other introverts can flourish.
You are listening to an Intentional Media Production podcast.